Okay, I think we'll make a start. Firstly, good morning, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us this morning. This is the first one of these webinars we've done in a while now, so hopefully it will be a useful session for you. It's part of our new FutureFit series of events, so we're hopefully going to be running these webinars a bit more regularly going forward. So just to take you through the session today, the theme for the event is Basel 3.1, strong, but is it simple? I'll introduce you to Hanbury in a minute, who will be running this session today and taking you through our presentation. So just in terms of an agenda, we'll introduce you to Hanbury. I'll let Hanbury introduce himself. It's probably better. We're then going to open the session just with a quick question for the audience. We'll be using Slido for this. So if you could use the QR code on the right-hand side of your screen, or use the pin code at the bottom there, just go to slido.com and you can access the questions. We'll also be using Slido for a Q&A at the end as well. So if you've got any questions throughout the event, please do submit them there and Hanbury will answer them at the end of the session. Following that, we'll go through Hanbury's presentation, which will introduce you to the Basel reforms, provide an overview, and then some specific information about the changes in the EU and the UK specifically. And then, as I say, at the end of the session, we'll have some time for a Q&A. So please do submit your questions through the Slido. I know there's a chat functionality on WebEx, but we're trying to use Slido today. It's a bit easier to use. So please submit all of your questions there. Perfect. Okay, so by way of introduction, Hanbury, I will pass over to you to introduce yourself. I know this says introductions, but you're the main speaker for today. Just by way of introduction to myself, I'm Tom Andy, so I work in the business development and account management team at VERMEG, so work with a number of our reg reporting clients. So I'll be kind of running this session in the background today, but Hanbury will be your main source of knowledge. So Hanbury, I'll hand over to you to provide a quick introduction before we do a quick Slido question and then onto your content.
Let's try that again. Thank you, Tom. My name's Hanbury Hampton-Turner. I'm the functional authority for VERMEG. So I run a team of SMEs who do regulatory interpretation, both in the UK and Europe and around the world. I'm also the head of regulatory product for UK and Europe under Malcolm, who is the global head. And yes, I'm very much focused on trying to understand what the business implications are of regulatory change and how we can design the product to meet those changes. I'll be talking to you today about Basel 3.1, which is sometimes known as Basel 4, depending upon which country you're in. But in the UK and Europe, it tends to be Basel 3.1. The two are the same set of changes. Can you have next slide, please, Tom?
Sure. So we've got a quick question to start.
Oh, yes.
So here's the question for the audience. If you had to pick one, which aspect of Basel 3.1 is going to cause the biggest problem for you and your firm? So this is live on Slido now. Please use the QR code. I'll switch to the Slido screen in a minute so we can start seeing some of the results. I believe the Slido question's live. I'll leave this here for a minute and then I'll swap to the Slido to see the results. Okay, let's look at some of the results here.
So that's very interesting. Obviously, credit risk is top of the pack there, being the biggest focus for changes and the biggest number of changes and the largest gap between where we are now and where we're going to be. But it's also interesting that people are worrying about sourcing of data and liquidity. because those are going to be changes, significant changes to the way people do business.
Cool. Okay. Well, we'll leave this poll open, so we'll crack on. But please do feel free to submit your input and response to that question as we go through. I will move on, Hambry, to the first section of Basel reforms. So I'll hand back over to you, Hambry.
So a brief history of where we are, how we got here. Basel I was introduced quite some time ago now to measure, introduce the principle of measuring capital against risk expenditure, so comparing capital to RWAs, and setting a sort of default ratio of 8%, which then gets varied depending upon the type of risk and the type of situation. Basel II divided that into different tiers of capital, so the capital changed by having tier 1 capital, tier 2 capital, and so on. And the exposures were split between risk and liquidity. UK and Europe have traditionally focused on risk and risk measures. Places like the US have traditionally focused on liquidity. So this is the attempt to put both in, putting liquidity in effectively as a modifier to the existing risk calculations. Then there was a slight incident. There was a confusion over how mortgage-backed derivatives and securitizations work, which led to $2 trillion being lost globally. There's a lot written about that incident, so I won't discuss it further. But obviously, that has a fairly major impact on what the direction the rules take, which leads us to Basel III, where Tier 1 capital. The lesson they took from there was that you needed better quality capital. So Tier 1 capital goes up 6% of the total 8%, and additional capital buffers and leverage ratio get put on a country-by-country basis. There were some changes to risk exposure introduced at this time. I don't want to downplay that. There were quite a few changes. But Basel 3.1 can be seen as the attempt to improve the RWA side of the fallout from the 2008 crisis. So it's mostly looking at risk exposure calculations, how those are arrived at, and also there's a strong theme for discouraging the use of internal models, some of which were blamed, failure or otherwise, for the looseness around the 2008 disaster. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Obviously, this is a global phenomenon. It's not just in the UK. We've highlighted various countries which are either have or will be introducing Basel 3.1 / Basel 4 returns. Some of them are actually live and agile, as we've indicated. And so we have, taken the 3.1 Basel 3.1 changes, implemented the product, and given that product to clients who are now using it. So this isn't our first. This isn't our first time at this. We do have experience in doing this overall. There is a considerable variation globally about how the rules are interpreted. Obviously, the BIS documentation is not binding. Each country is allowed to put its own variation down, and some of those variations are considerable. In particular, the complexity of 3.1 varies a great deal. In some countries, it's very simple. In some countries, it's very complex. Next slide, please. So you can guess what type of country we're in. The regulator has stated that they're looking to rebalance standards towards risk sensitivity over simplicity. So they've given a choice between having simple rules and having rules that are sensitive to the risks, and they've chosen very much to go for the risk sensitivity, i.e. the more complicated option. There appears to be belief that credit risk, which at the present day, at the moment, contains about 2,100 separate calculation steps, if you include SACA, is too simple. It's not sensitive enough, and so they are looking to replace it with replace large sections of it with a more advanced approach. Yeah, next, please. So, what is it? What's in it? Let's take a quick overview of it. So last year, the regulators enforced changes to counterparty credit risk, SACA, which is a standardized approach to counterparty credit risk. And that was a major change to credit risk calculations covering derivatives, SFTs, and clearinghouses. Clearinghouse transactions, rather. Transactions cleared through a clearinghouse. And the big change there was that everything was organized into netting sets and hedging sets. So rather than calculating risk on an individual basis, we're calculating it on a portfolio basis. You have a portfolio of trades. That portfolio has certain risk characteristics, and banks are responsible for identifying those characteristics and calculating risk as appropriate on the portfolio as a whole. Basel 3.1, in its very simplest form, is attempting to apply that same theme, that same approach to vanilla credit risk, i.e. everything that's not derivatives, SFTs, and clearinghouse transactions, and to market risk. So everything, all the exposures will be grouped into netting sets. Each netting set will have one or more hedging sets within it, and banks will be responsible for identifying the risk drivers of each hedging set. So if a hedging set has interest rate risk and equity risk in it, then you have to do one calculation for interest rate risk and one calculation for equity risk for that hedging set. The expectation is that many of these hedging sets will have more than one risk driver simultaneously, which increases the risk. Can I have next slide, please? So as well as that core change to credit risk and market risk, which is really what it's about, there's also changes in other areas. Operational risk gets its own calculation for the first time. And we'll go into that in a bit more detail. Capital and liquidity have calculation changes, particularly liquidity. The regulator is going for a very different approach there, and I'll get onto that. Large exposures and leverage ratio are going to change largely because of the changes to market risk and credit risk. They both use market risk and credit risk data. Credit ratings are no longer accepted. That's sort of quite a dramatic headline. The reality is a little more prosaic. But the idea is, for Basel 3.1, is that you'll no longer be able to accept credit ratings from a credit ratings agency. Instead, banks will have to take in the data that credit rating agencies use to calculate their credit ratings, and then to identify the ratings themselves. At a sort of very basic level, this doesn't make any difference. Rather than getting in a single rating, you get a set of data that points to a rating, and the credit rating agency is more than happy to show you how to calculate the same result they got. But it does push the responsibility for credit ratings from the credit rating agencies onto the banks, and the credit rating agencies then just become data providers. We've been talking to a few credit rating agencies about this, in particular Fitch, who we've shoved their logo up at the top right-hand corner. We've also been talking to some of the others, and we are confident this can be done in a seamless fashion. So, rather than just taking a credit rating and applying it, taking a credit rating information, work out how to do that, and then include that instead. From a sort of reporting view, the process doesn't really change all that much, but obviously there is that extra element of responsibility, that extra step in the process. There's also some changes bundled into this for Pillar 3 and ESG. This is partly because the changes being done for Basel 3.1 aren't going to affect these areas. Both Pillar 3 and ESG have figures in them that are specifically and explicitly based upon regulatory information and regulatory figures. So some of the numbers that appear in ESG reporting, for example, come from the regulatory returns. There is no way around that. They are defined as the regulatory information, and they must reconcile to the regulatory information, which will be maybe an interesting surprise to certain ESG efforts going on in various banks. But there is a regulatory tie in the UK for Pillar 3 and ESG that you can't get away from. The other thing I'll point out is that obviously everything we're talking about here is a CP, is a consultation paper or a discussion or a proposal. We do not have the final set of rules. We have not identified the precise changes. In particular, the credit risk and market risk changes. We understand the principles, but the specific changes are still a bit vague. It's going to be similar to SACA. It's going to be similar to some of the other Basel III applications we've seen in other places like Hong Kong, particularly Hong Kong, because we think that's the closest match we've found so far. But it's going to be more complicated than that. It's going to be hopefully more defined than that. And we haven't yet seen these rules from the regulator. It's possible that everything will get published on time. I am not going to rely upon that idea. Based upon previous initiatives of this type, we are likely to see rules published later than expected. We're likely to see additional changes being published after the main rule set, up to and beyond the implementation date. So for SACA, we were still getting changes after the implementation date had already passed. So this is going to be a continuous thing. It's going to be, there will be tweaks and bits and pieces added to it over the course of next year up until January 1st, 2025, which is the implementation deadline for the UK. We can't afford to wait until everything's clarified. We can't afford to wait until we have a clear set of rules because we're going to run out of time. And I suspect that's going to be true of any major project to implement these changes. So we're very much in the business of identifying what is stable up front, what can be done early, and pouncing on the rules changes when and if they emerge. Cover the next slide, please. So just a brief comparison here between the UK and the EU, because this is very important to some people. Basel 3.1 in the EU is a single approach. It's one piece. It's not divided into halves or sections, but it is divided country by country. There's a very, very large menu of country by country exceptions and country by country discretions, which needs to be borne in mind. The experience of Basel 3.1 in Spain will not be the same as the experience of Basel 3.1 in the Netherlands. There are many areas of divergence between the EU and the UK. This is probably the first time we're seeing a major rules initiative where the UK and the EU are diverging to a significant extent, which will be exciting for those people who are tracking Brexit divergence. We're seeing in the EU output floors by subsidiary, not by group. So the output floor in the UK is done on the group level. On the EU, it's done on the subsidiary level. There are various escape clauses that are being proposed, which may provide exceptions to Basel 3.1, valid up until 2032. We've got variations on specialized infrastructure lending, property lending. The removal of RBA approach is going to be slower and spread over many years, and market risk is going to be quite different because market risk in Europe does tend to be quite different. In general, we can have transitional provisions and country by country discretions that will result in a gradated approach up to 5 years. And the rules for the EU should be finalised at the end of Q2. As before, I would suggest that that's an aspiration. We may get the rules on time, we may not. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, Basel 3.1 in the UK is broken up into pieces, so it's a little more divided than the European approach. First, it's divided into two halves. The first half, the bit that the regulator is trying to clarify early, are the changes to liquidity, changes to capital, changes to leverage and operational risk, and the changes to Pillar 3. And there are a couple of examples of those changes in there. The second half is then the sort of big meaty changes to credit risk, counterparty credit risk, and market risk. And that is going to be published second because it's more complicated and the regulator needs more time. There is a problem with this approach, and that problem is that the first half is very much dependent on the second half. So the changes to capital, the changes to leverage ratio, changes to Pillar 3 are all dependent upon the changes to the credit risk and market risk calculations. So unless there's a clear view of what those are, the first half can only really be provisional. So what we're likely to see is the first half being published first, those rules coming out first, then the second half being published, then the first half being clarified, and then the second half being clarified, and then further tweaks thereafter. So despite what the impression that being given, I suspect we are not going to get the rules all in one swoosh. We're going to get them bit by bit, and they won't necessarily be in the order that we would hope them to be. I've also put in here the main approach and strong and simple approach. That's the other division. So some firms qualify for what is supposed to be a simpler approach, which is the strong and simple approach for the smaller firm. It's a little more complicated than that, and I'll go into that in a second. But the main thing I would emphasize at this point is that the main approach and the strong and simple approach are suspiciously similar in size. There are fewer things in the strong and simple approach. The strong and simple approach is simpler, but not by a whole lot. That may change once we get the credit risk and market risk rules out, but at the moment, strong and simple is about 70% of the main approach. So just bear that in mind. Individual rules are simpler, but the rules are that there are about 70 to 80% of the same number of rules to change. Next slide, please. Thank you. So do you qualify for the strong and simple approach? There are 6 criteria published by the regulator. We basically just nicked their diagram because it's pretty good. It's based on size, it's based on limited trading activity, and it's based on IRB approvals. In general, IRB approvals are going away. The regulator considers all existing IRB approvals to be based upon the existing rules. Since the rules are changing, all the IRB permissions, existing permissions, will become invalid. You can reapply for the same internal model that you use now, but none of them will be carrying on without further approval. They are literally getting rid of all of them. So that's worth looking at if you have an internal model that you like and are dependent on. There are no, as default, there are no IRB approvals for the main for the strong and simple approach, but the firms are allowed to develop an IRB application as part of the strong and simple approach if they feel they can do that. The regulator seems a little, show us what you've got about on this topic. Second slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, these are the second set of criteria. The one I'd point out is domestic activity. This is catching a lot of banks out. If most of your business is not domestic, you don't qualify. So we have a lot of small banks out there that are qualifying for the more complicated approach. All these rules are available on the regulator's website. Obviously, they're also in this webinar presentation. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay. Other points to note about strong and simple approach. The same approach has to be used for an entire group. So if one of your one part of the group and everything's on a group basis. So if your group as a whole does not qualify for the strong and simple approach, then your component parts won't qualify either. Firms of foreign groups can apply for a waiver, which suggests that the regulator is going to be looking at what the composition of that group is, even though it's operating abroad. And all IRB models, again, must be reapplied for or moved to the standardized approach. This is a sort of continuing theme running through. The first half of proposals, as we said, will cover net stable funding ratio, liquidity calculations, a new template for ILAP. This is on the strong simple approach specifically. First half is covering these changes. I would specifically point you to the ILAP. That's the liquidity disclosure document that is published every year alongside the ICAP. The regulator is putting a lot more emphasis on the ILAP now. In particular, the regulator is looking at the quality of the ILAP as an indicator for how much liquidity risk to charge a firm. So the liquidity risk calculation is subject to a modifier depending upon how well the regulator thinks you're managing liquidity, in particular what the ILAP looks like. So the ILAP is going to become a much more important document than it was in the past. There are some changes to Pillar 3 disclosure templates, partly because the new rules would demand it, and partly because some of the Pillar 3 disclosure templates are quite out of date. And there's also some proportionality measures. So they're changing the boundaries on what is considered proportional or disproportional in terms of various reporting obligations, which means that the number of returns, the scope of reporting you do may be subject to change under the strong and simple approach. Second half of proposals for the strong and simple approach will be published next year. That is quite late. Let's hope that the credit risk and market risk rules are going to be very strong and very simple, because if they're not, then there's going to be a bit of a scramble there. But yes, they're being published next year. Let's hope it's early next year. Next slide, please. Okay, UK main approach. So this is the main approach now we're talking about, and this is specifically the changes to credit risk. There's one big change, I'll put it in bold at the top. which is obviously this portfolio-driven approach to vanilla credit risk. So all the changes we saw to SACA, standardized approach for counterparty credit risk, will now be applied to all the other credit risk exposures. That includes things like loans, bonds, which includes the treatment of collateral, that includes free deliveries, that includes exposures in default, and so on and so forth. There's also a lot of smaller changes, and I would not underestimate the smaller changes. I think they're going to be the bulk of the work. CRM, that's the application of collateral guarantees to your risk exposures, is being overhauled. Those are mostly sensible changes, I think, that are just more of the same, done in a more intelligent fashion. None of the rules they're proposing that in this space are incompatible with the way things are done at the moment. And in fact, for some of these changes, we're actually just applying them to our existing reporting early, so that people can use them if they wish to. The SME and infrastructure special measures, these were introduced during the COVID crisis. They're sort of various arbitrary percentages that are applied to various risk exposures. Those are going away and being incorporated back into the main approach. External rating agencies, I've already mentioned, you no longer be able to just get a credit rating from an external agency. You have to work out the credit rating yourself, although the credit rating agencies will be delighted to tell you how to do that. Off-balance sheet items are being made, there's more distinctions being drawn. At the moment, it's just a big list over in Annex 2, whereby if it's on the list, then it applies as an off-balance sheet exposure. It's going to be a bit more nuanced now, the distinction between different types of off-balance sheet items. Commitments are finally getting some rules. The lack of rules around commitments, particularly long-term commitments, has been raised with the regulator a number of times over the last since Basel I came out. We are finally getting some rules around commitments. So if you make a promise to someone to give them a mortgage, then that actually creates a risk exposure. Most firms have already been doing this on a sort of informal basis, but we're now getting some published rules around it, which is good. Transaction-related contingent items are also changing. Mortgage risk and real estate exposure is changing. Equities exposures and default and high risk items is changing. So all these are not to do with putting things in portfolios. These are just to do with changes in the way credit risk works. They're also going to be splitting credit risk mitigation between SACA and standardized credit risk. So what this means in practice is that you can't use the same hedging pool for your CCR exposures, that is transactions cleared through clearinghouses, SFTs and derivatives. You can't use the same collateral and guarantees for that pool as you can for vanilla credit risk trades. Again, the regulator is fond of putting these sort of bars into the application of collateral. We're likely to see more of these divisions being put in place. Volatility adjustment is changing. CVA risk is very much changing. They're overhauling the formula entirely. So watch this space if you do CVA risk. And of course, SACA itself is changing. Even though they introduced it last year, they still want to make some changes to make everything consistent around credit risk. Could I have the next slide, please? Not to mention market risk. I know it's a minority interest for most of you, but there are some important changes in market risk. Again, it's being made more like SACA. However, there's going to be an option to retain something more similar to the existing system instead. So firms will be able to choose. There are more rules around what is in the trading book and non-trading book, because people are still playing fast and loose with moving things from one to the other. There's going to be a restriction on what counts as an internal hedge. Treatment of CIUs is being overhauled. The previous rules on CIUs were got introduced the year before last. Those are being overhauled. I think they've seen them in operation. They want to make some changes. The big one, which people probably ought to focus on, is the non-trading book FX and commodities. There's going to be a separate treatment for non-trading book FX. And while that's not alarming in itself, what that does mean is that people who are doing market risk just to do FX exposures may not have to do that anymore. If they're using a special non-trading book FX calculation, then they don't need to do market risk. This has big implications around people who are just doing market risk to control their FX exposures, and it also has even bigger implications for certain specialist firms or specialist subsidiaries, where doing an obligation to do market risk triggers all sorts of other obligations on top. So investment firms in particular, this is a big change to the KMPR, and if you have other specialized subsidiaries, then there may be a big impact on them on that point. But yes, a very welcome addition, a non-trading book FX calculation. The next slide, please. Other changes to the main approach. Liquidity is the big one. The regulator is proposing an add-on to the LCR calculation, liquidity ratio, based on a subjective review of Pillar 3 adherence, particularly the ILAP. So the regulator is going to be inspecting market disclosures, the Pillar 3 templates and the ILAP templates, and depending upon what they see, they will then give you a bigger or smaller add-on to the liquidity risk charge. So this is not only this is a big change the way the regulator usually does things. They don't usually incorporate subjective judgments directly into the risk calculations, but here we are. And I suspect this reflects a situation we see in the market today where certain we're getting a lot of liquidity risk at the moment. Obviously, inflation is very high, interest rates are unexpectedly high, and reading between the lines, it is possible that there's a fair amount of liquidity risk floating out there, and people falling foul of this. So the regulator is really cracking down on liquidity. Watch this space. This is very much sort of a market-driven change. As well as the existing liquidity measures, they're also including franchise viability risk and intraday liquidity risk. Intraday liquidity risk is particularly worth looking at because anything that you have to do multiple times a day is a proportionally much bigger burden on the firm than anything else. So whatever you can do to minimize or automate intraday liquidity risk is well worth looking at. We may well be getting templates for ILAP. So this is where the regulator gives you a template which includes information that you have to disclose in the ILAP in that format, in that way, calculated in that fashion. Whether or not you literally have to reproduce the template in the ILAP document is not been decided, or at least not been published. But it's likely that there'll be certain calculated bits of information that will need to be included in the ILAP, and those will have to come from the regulatory calculations because there's nowhere else to source them. Similarly, NSFR changes. There'll be additional requirements scaled by firm, so larger firms will be getting more. We're getting more requirements on net stable funding ratio and additional liquidity monitoring metrics. Capital is largely, there are going to be some changes, but there are a lot of changes to capital in Basel 3. We're not seeing a huge amount in Basel 3.1. The main thing is retooling some of the buffer amounts, which are obviously entirely based around which country you're operating in. So have a look at the additional buffers. They're going to be reshuffling those around and possibly reducing the number of them. CVA portfolio risk, they are changing the calculation. We have not seen the new calculation. It's very difficult to say what the nature of the change is going to be, but it's a purely mathematical calculation and it's going to change. IRB internal models, all existing model permissions will expire. All existing internal and IRB models will need to be reapplied for. The output floor calculations we've seen suggest that if you do use an internal model in future, you'll have to calculate the standardized approach alongside it in order to compare one to the other. And this will be a requirement for the output floor calculation, but it does mean, in effect, that using an IRB model cannot discharge the obligation of using the standardized approach as well. We'll have to do standardized approach calculations for everything, with maybe some IRB models on top. Other than that, I've covered everything there. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, and this is just a sort of sample bit. This is the operational risk calculation. This is the calculation that I've identified tentatively as being the least likely to change. It doesn't have a lot of dependencies on the other changes. I mean, we're going to try and implement it first on the basis that if we're going to do something early, we want to do something early that is stable. You'll probably have seen this kind of operational risk capital times business equals business indicator component times alpha I, times internal loss modifier several times from several different firms. What I would say is that in the UK, if we have the next slide, please. Does this work? Yeah, there you go. In the UK, the ILM is being replaced with 1. So we don't need to calculate an internal loss modifier. It's totally irrelevant. It's just going to be 1. So everything is focused on the business indicator component. Business indicator component is a 3-year average of the ILDC plus SC plus FC, which are 3 components of operational risk that the regulator identified: interest, leases and dividends, services and financial components. Take a 3-year average of the historical losses for those. If you don't have historical losses, you have to use future predicted losses. Take a 3-year average of those and multiply that by the alpha I. The alpha I is the graph on the right there, as the chart on the right there. Depending upon the size of the BI, the 3-year average you've calculated, the alpha I will be that second column, 12%, 15%, or 18%. And that's more or less it. So that's how the business indicator component is working. Obviously, how the IDLC, SC, and FC are calculated is yet to be gone into in huge detail. It is, given the amount of data that needs to be processed here, I would strongly recommend automating this. If nothing else, change to operational risk are likely to be something that people will be wanting to track intra-year. So I've covered, as I said before, we are proposing to do this particular section. Proposing to do this particular section early because I don't think this is going to change much. They've been trying to change operational risk for a while now. They've finally done it. It doesn't really have much to do with the other changes being made in Basel 3.1, so it's relatively standalone. We're going to try and produce a calculation for this this year and see how that goes. I hope it doesn't change. So I've tried to cover sort of the most interesting or the most salient parts of Basel 3.1, Basel 4. I don't know if people have any questions either on Slido or by other means if you can't get access to Slido. But I'm happy to answer some questions from this point. Tom, is there anything you want to say?
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thanks, Henry. We have a final question for the audience.
Sorry.
So I will give the audience a minute to answer that. I think we've launched that question now. If not, I'll ask Alfie to do that on Slido. And then following this, there's also a Q&A option on Slido as well. So please feel free to ping any questions you have for Hanbury into Slido. If anyone has any trouble with Slido, then please feel free to use the WebEx chat and I can read them out to Hanbury from there. So we'll give people a minute to answer that and I'll share the Slido results and then we'll take any questions. I think we've got a couple on Slido already. Okay, so we're getting some results through. What do you think, Hanbury? Does this surprise you or?
No, not particularly. I mean, I think that this is a fairly fair. I mean, a lot of people have been looking at these rules as clues and pieces of them have been published over the last year or so. Obviously, we don't have the final version yet, so not everyone is going to have started their assessment. And some people may feel they've got a fairly good grip on what's going to change and already have the budget in place. But obviously, you know, we don't know what the final rules are going to look like. So we have a fairly good idea of what they're going to look like, but we don't have them. So I think, yeah, this is a fairly decent spread. It's interesting that people, you know, only a third of respondents really feel that they're ready, less than a third, really feel that they're ready for Basel 3.1. We're due to get the final version of the rules sometime this quarter or end of this quarter or during next quarter, let's hope. And hopefully that, you know, then the percentages will change. But I think there's a lot of different pieces, there's a lot of different moving pieces in Basel 3.1. It's one thing to know, you know, what the bulk of the changes are and where your effort should be concentrated. It's quite another to have a checklist for all the different things that need to change. And yeah, I don't think we're there yet.
No.
Okay, fairly ready to drop down to a quarter now.
Slowly dropping. Okay, Alfie, is it okay if we pause that poll and let people use the Q&A? Okay, so here's a question we have live. Andrew, you can see this, right?
Yep, I can see it. So the UK
screen.
approach to 3.1 credit risk is complicated rather than simple. It is. What change do you expect for capital rules for simpler regime firms? I expect them to be many and numerous. So what I'm seeing, based upon the consultations they've had specifically on strong and simple approach, which was published earlier this year, and it's worth a read because it's not entirely the same as the previous document. What I'd say is that there's going to be quite a few different changes in quite a few different areas, just like the main approach, but the changes are going to be slightly simpler. So I would say for the capital rules, capital itself probably not changing, but the capital risk, which is presumably what you're referring to, the risk exposure versus capital. The risk exposure calculations, I think, is going to be we're going to have the same change to the approach of credit risk. I don't think they can get away from that. I don't think make that simpler. We're going to have a similar or same change available to market risk, but with additional optionality. And I think liquidity is going to remain harsh because the regulators are really cracking down on liquidity at the moment. What I think you'll probably see simple gains is in terms of the reporting that needs to be done. So they will forgive you certain returns. There may be a less harsh regime around things like group solvency or some of the more advanced credit risk returns that were associated with SACA. I mean, SACA introduced, a great many new credit risk returns. We're probably going to see that for Basel 3.1. The strong and simple approach will probably miss out on some of that and probably have a lower reporting threshold for that. So I think the main gains that strong and simple approach firms will get is around applying certain calculations, which probably isn't going to help them all that much. But they'll probably get lesser impact in terms of how much reporting they have to do, how many returns they have to check, how often they have to submit. But that's the pattern we've seen in the past. Next question. Can you please elaborate on how credit ratings will be impacted on 3.1 in terms of its calculation, used data supplied by credit rating agencies? So at the moment, credit rating agencies collect in a lot of data about different firms. They give them each firm and countries. They give each firm and country a credit rating, and then those credit ratings get delivered to the bank. Under the Basel 3.1, you will not be allowed to take an external credit rating in from a credit rating agency. What you'll have to do is take the information that the credit rating agency collects and analyzes, take that analysis, look at the various factors yourself, and then apply a credit rating to that information. It will probably be the same credit rating for most banks. It will probably be a credit rating calculated using a step-by-step guide given to you by the credit rating agency. The difference in credit rating will probably be zero. But it does mean that the responsibility for deciding what that credit rating is will be transferred from the credit rating agency to the bank. We have some slides that go into a lot more detail on this if people are fascinated, which we can potentially make available to people. I'll leave that one up to Tom. Right. With the many ways to fall out of the strong and simpler treatment, in what circumstances is it worth pursuing? Well, I don't know as much you can do to pursue it. I mean, it's done on a group basis, so you can't subdivide the firm or spin off a subsidiary in order to qualify for one or the other. And based upon the tenor of the remarks from the regulator, rather, it seems likely that if you span off a subsidiary into another country, they would probably still count it as being part of your core operations. So I'm not sure that there's much that can be done apart from deliberately shrinking one aspect of your business or growing another in order to be strong and simple. I don't think strong and simple is all that worthwhile, but then I'm talking from the point of view of someone who does automation. So if you're going to automate some calculations, it doesn't really matter how complicated each individual calculation is. All that matters is how many you have to do. And for strong and simple, you have to do more or less the same number as you do for the main approach. So I would say it's probably not worth pursuing if you're going to automate. If you're doing things by hand, absolutely worth pursuing, because the main approach will be more complicated, more confusing. But if you're not doing things by hand, I would say it's probably not worth it. But I'm not sure there's much you can do for one or the other anyway. Is it likely the 1st January 2025 date may change? No, obviously, of course not. Of course not. I suspect it probably won't for most firms. It might change for the strong and simple approach. I mean, the scenario I can see is that strong and simple people will be given strong and simple firms will be given a slightly longer deadline to apply, largely to reduce pressure on the regulator. But I don't think it's going to slip. It's a year and a half away still. So if something goes horribly wrong, I guess there might be something. But I think the regulator has previously, rather than change the deadline, has given us changes to the rules several days after the implementation date goes live. So I mean, historically, the regulator has not moved these deadlines in order to make things easier for banks. There's a big outcry from the consultation papers, maybe, but I think the 1st January 2025 is something that they've agreed on an international basis. I think that they're going to be reluctant to climb down from that. In the operational risk calculation formula, will it be increased by VERMEG? Yes. I mean, assuming you take our calculations. If not, you touch the various variables of the formula. The variables are 3-yearly average, simple average of operations around internal leases, dividends, and other sort of services payments, financial component, and the financial service components as the slides I showed. The details for how to calculate each of those components have not yet been published. But once you take the 3-year average of those, then you multiply it, then that forms your BI, added together forms your BI, and then the BI determines what your alpha R is. So really, the main thing is calculating those 3 components, and I haven't got the detail for that yet. Some of the questions appear to have disappeared. I don't know if they've.
I've been closing them off as we
Okay,
go.
fine, right.
I think that's it.
Yeah.
I did ping that last question came in from the WebEx chat, so I pushed it across.
Lovely. Okay.
But I think that's it now. So if anyone's got any questions following this webinar, please do feel free, if you're a client of ours, to get in touch with your account manager. If you're not a client, feel free to get in touch with me or Hanbury, and we can always help and have a more detailed conversation on any of these points. But I think we'll wrap up there, unless you've got anything else, Hanbury.
I'm good. I would just say, obviously this is a global change. It's affecting a lot of countries around the world. The regulator is under a lot of pressure to make UK look competitive and look good in comparison to other countries. So I think we are unlikely to see a lessening of the rules or a slip in the deadline in order to relieve pressure on banks. I think the reverse tendency will be in case. What the most likely scenario is if it becomes unviable, the regulator will keep the same deadline, keep the same requirements, keep the same strictness of rules, and just enforce it more loosely to start with, which is what they did for Saka. So I think it's going to come. It probably won't be avoided, and it's going to be quite a tight fit because we're changing almost every aspect of the calculations over the course of a year and a half, and we don't yet have the full details. So plans to do stuff this year. Make sure you've got your teams and budget in place next year, and good luck.
Perfect. Thanks, Hanbury, and thanks everyone for joining. We will share some slides after this as well. I know that's a common question, so we'll have those sent out soon. But thanks all for your time. We'll wrap things up here.